Hello, this is Coach Aaron Saft in the MR Runningpains podcast. I've got a great guest today. I can't say how much I really enjoyed this conversation. Really pulled a lot from it, and I hope you do too. Andrew Bednarzik is a mental performance coach and licensed therapist, and also a professor of sports psychology. It's just a great conversation about negative self-talk and how do we get ourselves out of that situation, or how do we prepare for when that situation arises? What can we do better? What can we recognize as negative self-talk? So lots of strategies here, lots of ways to get through it. It's just like I said, a wonderful conversation with Andrew. So I hope you really enjoy this conversation with Andrew. At the end of the conversation, I had a few questions arise about training, which I certainly appreciate, and I want to continue to answer those questions. So I will get to that after my conversation with Andrew, as well as catch you up on a lot of things. But I want to thank you all, not only for the questions, but for the support. Just some really positive feedback coming in about the episodes. I really appreciate that you liked the training update. Thank you for listening to that. I hope you could pull some stuff away from that as well in that conversation, or not the conversation, but that, that episode that I talked about my training for the Grand Slam. So if you continue to have questions, don't hesitate to ask. You can come in on whatever platform. I've been getting, Facebook Messenger, questions on Strava, wherever. I don't mind. Email, whatever it is. Happy to answer those questions and have more to talk about on the podcast, because that's really what this podcast is about. I really want to help others kind of learn their what best way to train themselves, how to engage and be more present in your training. And I think this conversation will help you do so. So again, I will wrap up this episode with a few Q&A answers and also kind of talk about a few other things that are going on. So thank you. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Andrew, and I'll speak to you afterwards. I have with me Andrew Bednarzik. Did I pronounce that right?
You did.
And Andrew, how do you go by? Do you go by doctor?
No, I'm a therapist and a mental performance coach. Mostly I go by Andrew.
Okay. I didn't know how you'd like to have your clients refer to you, so thank you. And Andrew and I were talking before this podcast, but I want Andrew to have the chance to introduce himself and tell everybody who he is, where he's come from, where he's going, what he does, all that good stuff. So Andrew, why don't you take it away?
Yeah. So Andrew Bednarzik, and like I said, I'm a mental performance coach in addition to being a therapist. So I have two separate businesses. The mental performance coaching is more of what we'll talk about today. The name of that business is Headwaters Coaching, and also a therapist. So I've been doing therapy for the past 5 to 6 years, and working with athletes for the past 3 or 4, and then have transitioned into coaching in the past year. So working with athletes for a long time, but realized that it really falls more under coaching than therapy. So and I really enjoy working with athletes, helping them with all kinds of things: performance anxiety, overcoming negative self-talk, which we'll talk a lot about today. Some athletes get really focused on mistakes that they've made and have trouble moving past that. For runners, it's a lot of what's going on in their mind while they're running. Overcoming injuries is big, the mental component of overcoming injuries, because there's a physical rehab, and then there's also usually some component of fear of getting back out there. Am I going to be the same? So those are some of the things that I work with athletes on.
Great. Awesome. And then your own education, what did that kind of entail?
Sure. Yeah, so I kind of found my way into this field. I was my undergrad degree was in psychology, and then got my master's in counseling, which led to me becoming a therapist. And I saw a lot of different types of clients in my therapy practice, and then realized about 5-6 years ago, I ran into someone who has been mentoring me, who's a sports psychologist, and I had heard of the field, but just for some reason hadn't considered it as something that I could do. And I've played sports my entire life. I grew up playing soccer competitively, and I grew up outside of Baltimore, Washington, D.C. area, and played my whole childhood, played in college. I've kept playing since. And looking back, realized a lot of different times when I struggled with some mental aspect of the sport, anxiety, or making mistakes and trying to move past those. Didn't really have the language for it at the time. But then as I started thinking about, I could work with athletes on these types of things, just started thinking about how much that's a big part of sports. And anyone who's an athlete, I think, intuitively knows that. So I started, mentoring with, his name's Bob Swope, Professor Swope. He's a sports psychologist. Like I said, he has a private practice and he works at Warren Wilson. So I've been working with him for the past 5-6 years, supervising me as I've worked with more and more athletes. And so my background as a player and then my skills as a therapist to combine those into just really enjoying working with athletes and, all of the different things that go into the mental part of sports. So I feel really lucky. Sports is just what I do. What I think about, what I do in my free time, and to combine that with my interest in psychology has been amazing. And to be building that as my career, I feel really lucky to be able to do that.
That is pretty awesome. Do you do anything on the physical side of coaching? Do you train athletes in that regard?
I don't. I'm really interested in that. I don't feel like I'm sort of probably qualified to do that, but in my own free time, listening to podcasts, my own training, my own overcoming injuries lately, is something I'm really interested in. But no, not something I train athletes on. I refer out to folks like you or other trainers or coaches.
And that's like, and I do the reverse. We certainly talk a lot. My athletes and I discuss a lot, as I kind of talked to you when we first met. We go over a lot of different mental aspects and read through a lot of books and talk about these various things. And perhaps we can talk about some of those resources today. But this side of the sport, just as you were just saying with your career, like not realizing this was a potential career for you, but I think more and more people are realizing how important this mental aspect of the sport really is, especially on the endurance side of things. When we get to events like the marathon and beyond, that mental component is so much of it. I love the quote that they say ultra running is 90% mental and the rest is in your head.
That's good. That's good.
So yeah, I love talking about this topic. Let's say, an athlete is coming to you. At what point would you say it is a great time to come to you if they're having issues with negative self-talk, which is our topic today?
That's a good question. I would say at the point at which they've noticed that it's really hampering their performance. So they've noticed their performance dipping, their times, two, I would say if they notice it's really affecting their enjoyment, which I know for runners, the word enjoyment probably isn't the right word to use, but their fulfillment it's just detracting from them being able to be engaged and feel that sense of, whatever word they would use, joy, fulfillment, accomplishment, because of this negative tapes running in their mind. And then lastly, there can be a lot of associations with what's going on in your mind and injuries. And that could be just from tension, if you're more tense while you're running or going into a race. It can be, like I said before, the fear of like, oh my gosh, is my knee going to hold up? And then you're unknowingly running differently or doing things differently because of that very understandable fear. So those would be three things that I would keep in mind for, a cue that like, oh, maybe this kind of mental training could help. So that would be, as far as like where they are in their training cycle, it doesn't really matter. I mean, the more time before like a big race, the better, so that we could have some time to like implement a few things. But like anything else, sometimes people realize it like, oh wow, I'm like really stressed and I have this race in 2 weeks. We can start, and then go from there.
And I would say there's probably maybe a fourth bucket that we could say, and that's like the pre-race negative self-talk, right?
Yeah.
Especially race week, where the butterflies are starting to get into the pit of your stomach, and you're just, all of this stuff starts happening in your brain. Like, did I train enough? Am am I healthy enough? All this, kind of. So maybe that fourth bucket there too, which is one I'd love to talk about as well.
Definitely.
But can we go back to one of the first buckets that you had said about? Can you give some examples of just a non-injured runner? They're training, right? But they're having negative self-talk. Can you kind of give some examples? Because people may not actually realize that they're having negative self-talk, right? It's something that it may just be so normalized to them, they don't really recognize that they're doing it. So can you kind of give some examples of what that would look like, or sound like to the person, to themselves?
Sure. Well, you just named one earlier, so I'm not prepared. As your week leading up to the race, you've done everything that you've set out to do. You've hit all your marks, 5 days before the race, and you find yourself starting to feel like, oh my gosh, I'm not ready. I'm not ready. I'm not prepared. I'm not going to be ever as fast as those guys, that guy, that person, that woman, So some, imposter syndrome can be a big one, where you objectively are, this type of runner, this good, this fast, but some part of your brain's telling you like, oh no, you're not in that category. You're never going to be like those people. So it can be, the sort of like fear of lack of preparation. Sometimes it can be, especially with distance sports, the fear of the pain, which is, again, very normal. I mean, from an evolutionary perspective, it's good to be cognizant of pain. And so, but the knowing like, wow, this is literally going to be painful, as any distance athlete, that's what you're signing up for. Then some of the negative self-talk can be like, I don't think I'm going to be able to handle this. I don't think I'm going to be able to push through. I don't think I'm going to be able to do 50 miles, even though you've done 50 miles many times, or maybe you haven't. And then that's the thing. It's new. I've never done that long. I've run a marathon, and so it could be, am I going to be able to do it? Am I going to be able to handle it? Is my body going to hold up, even if you're not injured? So those are, a comparison, like I alluded to before, thinking about other people you've trained with. Well, I'm not as fast as them. I'm never going to be as fast as them. So there can be a lot of varieties but those are some examples of what it might look like.
Perfect. Thank you. So with these ways that we create negative self-talk, would you say that sometimes excuses come with those? Like, I'm not prepared. I'm not ready for this race. I've been sick for, like a week, and, I haven't run in 3 days because I had to take care of X, Y, and Z. I've just been so busy with work. Does that component usually typically come along with self-talk, or are we talking two separate things here?
Well, I think that can come along. Yes, I think it can definitely come along with it, is the short answer, because I think what happens is your mind, so you start to get nervous about the race, and then your mind can start to find reasons why things might not go well, or reasons why I don't want to do it. Well, I've been sick. Oh, I haven't been able to train the past 3 days because I've been so busy at work. And so your mind can look for outs, like, oh, actually, you know what? We'll just sign up for that next race. So, you could call it excuses. You could call it, I would say it's sort of an anxious thought process of like looking for a way that maybe you don't need to do this thing that's going to be really hard and hopefully really fulfilling, but also really painful. And so I do think they're linked. And I think the key is, and this is not easy to do, but to try to delineate between, what is a reason maybe not to run, and what is like a pretty understandable, oh, my brain's looking for ways out. And that's subjective. That's subjective for the purpose of you running, how competitive you are, how important it is that you do this particular race, how important it is that you hit this particular time. But I'd say it's very common that people's minds would go there at some point pre-race to like, oh no, what if I'm not where I need to be because of X, Y, and Z. So I definitely think they're related because that's a normal kind of sort of nervous brain thought process.
Yeah. Well, the nervous brain, it can even present itself on a workout day, right? Like you had talked about, with the recognition of this is probably going to be hard. This might hurt a bit, like, and even I've had athletes that like long runs intimidate them, like even though they've grown, right? They've seen the progression, right? Like all of a sudden they get to whatever that benchmark mile is that just scares the bejesus out of them because they've never done it in training, but they're just very intimidated all of a sudden by this number, right? Like what can we do, or how can we help those athletes that are, let's just start with like mileage intimidation, where, it can be in the example of just a long run, or like we talked about earlier, a new distance in a race. How can we make those athletes a little bit more comfortable?
So I would say a really good one for that, and to use a running example, the 4-minute mile, before anyone had broke the 4-minute mile barrier, as far as I understand, people thought it was impossible. It was not physically, humanly possible. And so because of that mindset, no one broke it. And then when the first person broke it, was it Roger Bannister?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
So once he broke it, then a slew of other people quickly broke the 4-minute mile barrier. And so for me, that's clearly, and like you're alluding to, a mindset issue of like, oh man, am I going to be able to do that? Am I capable of breaking through that barrier, running that mileage, running that time, running those splits? So one thing that you can do is, until you've done it, until you've run a 4-minute mile or whatever it is, it really might be hard to picture that you could ever do it. So visualization, huge tool for this particular challenge, because what's happening when you visualize is you're literally training your brain to form or strengthen pathways that are picturing yourself hitting that mileage, and you're picturing it over and over again. And by picturing it, I mean the more effective visualizations are including as many senses as possible. So if it's a trail run that you've done before, or a race that you've done before, and you can picture the course, great. What sounds are present, what the temperature is, what you're wearing, who's around, any senses that you can bring in as you're visualizing this, the better, because then what happens is your brain really almost thinks that that's what's happening. I mean, that's not what's happening, but from a brain training, it's like, oh, this is happening. I ran that time. And it's almost like a really vivid dream, and you wake up and it takes you a bit to figure out, oh, that didn't actually happen. That's what you want. You want it to be as vivid as possible. And then repetition is really important, because, you're literally forming or strengthening those pathways in your brain. And then when you go to do it, your brain's like, hey, we've done this before, even though you haven't actually done it before. And so, especially for those kind of breakthrough new ground, I think that can be really, really helpful. And then usually once you've broke through, you can then picture doing it, and then maybe there's just different challenges in the next one, or trying to repeat that, or some conditions that scare you, like running in the rain or something like that. But visualization, I think, is a good one for that.
Cool.
That challenge.
Let me give an example of something that I did for a distance that, it was daunting to me. And you can pick holes in it and say where I could have improved, so people can, perhaps take something from it and improve upon it. But last year I ran the 200-mile race in Washington, Bigfoot, and a new distance for me, right? Like I tried not to be, as much as it's hard to be intimidated by the distance alone, and let alone having to do however much climbing we did. But what helped me was I went on YouTube and I watched video after video after video to understand the terrain, the course, the settings, get a picture in my mind of what I'd be facing out there, so I could visualize me running this trail, right? This, and having this environment around me. And, I started to memorize sections. People kept talking about this one section that just had this brutal climb. And it was really, it was pretty far into the race. And, I watched like 3 different videos of that section and people coming out of it. And, in my brain, I said, okay, it's just like doing, for us here, it's shut in. Okay. The shut in trail. So I in my brain, I kind of set it up. So I was like, I'm just running shut in. I know shut in like the back of my hand. And I was like, it's very similar to that. That's what I got to do. That's this section. And I got to that section, and I'll be honest with you, Andrew, I didn't even know the hill happened. We got done with this section and I was just like, well, that's it. It surprised me because I was prepared for it, right? Like I knew what to expect. I knew what the demands were going to be on my body. And I knew how to tackle it. Right. And then, to finalize it, I watched the finishes. So in my mind, I knew what the finish looked like. It finished on the track at this high school, and I knew what it looked like running into the track and around that track. And I just kind of pictured myself coming around that track. So when I saw it, it was just like, oh, there it is, like that's how I've been picturing it in my head. And I, in my brain, I kind of pictured coming around, fist pumping, just that, that victory pose of being able to finish. And that's what had been going and, transpiring in my brain for, God, 3-4 months was this finish at this track. And it just played out just like I had it in my mind, and so it was almost like you said, I had done it so many times. It was just, the completion of it, which was really cool, being able to, I love having that resource, that availability that, YouTube provides, and seeing that and reading people's race reports and getting more information about, about the course, what to expect, what they had, what they didn't had, what they wish they had, so it kind of filled in all of these gaps for me, even though I had never seen the course before. I had never run out there before. I was anticipating, okay, this is, what I'll need in this section. This is how hot it's going to be, and so when it got to those, I wasn't surprised by anything. I kind of already in my head had gone through it and been like, okay, this is how we envisioned it. I mean, there was a few times where, it wasn't how I envisioned it, but at the same time, you can't prepare for a 209-mile course. Exactly. So to say that it was like exactly as I thought, it wasn't. But I mean, for the most part, I had some really good, sections planned out that where I knew it was going to be, pretty difficult.
Yeah. So just to touch on a couple of those, I think you were right on with what you were doing. YouTube is an amazing resource to be able to picture a race, a place you've never been, a race you've never run before. And race reports and other information you can gather. And so just to talk about a couple different types of visualization that we're sort of intuitively doing, one would be to visualize the process. And that would be like the shut-in, the hill, knowing what's coming and like, this is how I'm going to approach this, either tactically or mindset wise. Like shut-in would be like a mindset. I've done this before. This is just the same, so when you're visualizing the process. This is how I'm going to do this. This is how I'm going to approach this. This is what I'm going to want to feel like, or, so, and that is helpful because sometimes you can do that in combination with the other one, which is picturing the outcome. And so that's the other thing you did by picturing the fist pump, picturing like watching, footage of the finish. And that's really helpful in a different way. It really is helpful for sort of that, like picturing that you can do it and telling your mind, like, you are going to finish, you're going to finish strong, and so you're literally, some people picture being on a podium, accepting a medal, that of like, oh, right, that is going to happen. I'm going to do that. And you're programming that's going to happen. Both are really helpful, the process and the outcome. I would say sometimes people need a little more of each one depending on kind of what their challenge might be. If they're really having trouble believing that they're going to finish or finish well or finish ahead of so and so, it might be more the outcome, like them believing that that can happen. If, the process, I'd say, is never a bad idea. That's always going to be helpful for how am I going to approach this part of the race? How am I going to approach that hill? Always helpful. And I mean, this is sort of an obvious statement, but I find preparation to be the number one thing that helps people feel less nervous. Whether that's a test or a public speaking or a race, the more you can prepare, and of course you're going to prepare training, physically training, but you can add mental training and visualization. The more you're prepared, the more you're going to feel, you're still going to feel nervous most likely, but you're going to feel more ready. The only thing I would add as far as poking holes that you could have done is there's sort of an 80-20 idea of 80% of the time practicing what you want to happen. This is how I want to approach that hill. This is how I want the finish to be. And then 20% practicing for like, well, what if it doesn't go well? What if, for cross country, what if I get cinched out when the crowd comes together at the beginning and I'm not where I want to be? What if I fall? What if that old injury kind of starts to creep in and my knee starts to ache, whatever it might be, which sounds a little counterintuitive, like, well, I don't want any of those things to happen. Well, sure, you don't want any of those things to happen. But like you said, in a 209-mile race, you can't prepare. You don't know exactly what's going to happen. So preparing for like, hey, if this happens, this is what I will do. If I start thinking in this way, this is what I'm going to tell myself. Shut in. I've done this before. So that can also really help preparation. It's just a way to tell your brain, like, hey, in case that happens, we're ready. Instead of like, well, let's just not think about that, which isn't a bad way to go. I'm not saying you want to think about those more than you need to, but hopefully you can think about things that may come up, sort of address them through visualizing this is what I'll do, and then spend most of your time picturing the positive, spend most of your time picturing the outcomes that you want. So yeah, that's the only thing I would add in.
Yeah. Well, it's also being able to recollect and utilize prior experience, right? Like, so when those negative things pop up, you can have something in your brain that you can utilize to deal with that obstacle or that, that piece that's just not going right. Right. So I'll take, for example, in the training for Bigfoot, I did out and back on the Art Loeb Trail, and a lot went wrong. There wasn't a lot that went right to that run. So I had all of these things that I'm like, okay, this I have to deal with because this isn't going to work at Bigfoot, so I already had a lot of things that I was like, I know this doesn't work. So, and I had time to revamp and be like, all right, it didn't work. So what do I do so that it will work? Right. So then I started, taking all those things and, trying to make sure that they wouldn't resurface at Bigfoot. I wouldn't have those problems at Bigfoot. So making sure in training, right, that I was eliminating every possibility of a negative outcome at Bigfoot by just making sure in my training, I tried everything. Be it footwear, be it my shorts, my shirt, my pack, my poles, like I found out that like that day, my gloves that like, there's gloves that come with the poles. They're Lecky poles. It was ripping up my hand. I was blistering super bad on the palm of my hand just because of one stitch. So I was like, well, I need these gloves. So I bought a pair of Lecky has these actual like fingerless gloves that didn't have the seam, and it eliminated that problem. But I wouldn't have known that, race day had I not done that long effort, because in my training runs, 3 to 4 hours wasn't enough time to rub the palm enough. But after a day of being on my feet using the poles, it sure was. So, trying to replicate these things now, it's hard to replicate these longer runs, right? Like these longer efforts in your training. But like when you get to those, like, as I told you, I'm running 50 miles next week. You want to try your gear, right? Like, what are you going to use in your big race so that you have that opportunity to have that longer period of time to find out these things?
Yeah.
But, just a good way. And that was something that I had learned when we talked about Addie Bracey's book, mental training for ultra running. That was something that, she said was that make sure you're ready for obstacles. Think about all of the things that could go wrong, right? Like, just like you were saying, like, be prepared for the worst. What are you going to do in these situations? Like, what happens if your stomach sours, right? Like, what do you do? Like, is your nutrition, do you have backups to your nutrition? Are there backups to your backups? Like, what are you going to do when things go south? So it's a great point, and I'm just trying to hammer it home and tell the folks how they can implement these things, within their training.
Yeah.
I would also say, when we talk about these things, when we talk about the race day, and when we're talking about negative self-talk, I would say that motivation, right? That has to be part of the conversation, right? Like, what's motivation? I was listening to, are you familiar with the Barclays marathons? Have you heard of this?
I've read and watched part of a documentary about it, so I'm familiar.
Okay.
Mysterious, but yes.
It is. It's a curiosity to most of us. But the two-time finisher, he finished this year, and previously, John Kelly, who was a native to that area, he said that in a lot of these races, you can be extrinsically motivated. Like, there's not a lot of times where you're going to get that, deep down to the core, where, like, you need a ton of intrinsic motivations in order to finish. Whereas in Barclays, he needed all intrinsic motivation in order to be able to finish it. And I would push back slightly, because in some of the races that, ultra runners do, there has to be, a good amount of intrinsic motivation. If your extrinsic motivation is the only thing that is going to get you through, right? And that negative self-talk starts coming in mid-race, right? Like, whatever, like, if you're just doing it for a belt buckle, that belt buckle is going to lose its worth so fast if that is your only piece of motivation.
Yeah.
Right. So, like, having that intrinsic value, right? The ability to look in and say, I'm not just doing this for me, right? There is a lot of valid reasons why I'm actually doing this. And, in my case for this year, I've got these fundraising efforts. I'm raising funds for challenged athletes. And, that's I've had so many people contribute, to that. So it's not only the fact that I'm running this for, two foundations. It's, I've got motivation from the athletes. I've also got motivation from my donors, right? There's just a lot of people that are supporting me. I've got people that are coming out to support me, right? My family's coming out. My friends are coming out. So it's like they're giving their time. So I've got all these components that are mixed into my why, my motivation. It's so, finding those values that you can impress upon yourself and draw upon when you get into that darkness. Those are the things that you can really draw upon. And I think that's what can dig you out of that negative self-talk when it starts to happen. Anything you can add to that piece?
Sure. I completely agree. So one way, the why that you said, finding your why, identifying your why, I find to be really, really valuable. And I would agree, as a person who's run maybe 5 miles at the most, I needed a lot of intrinsic motivation, so I can only imagine 50 miles or 100 miles. I'm sure Barclays is on another level, but I agree that it's really important that you, during those times when, you're feeling more down, or you're feeling more like, why would I push through this? That you have some things to draw on, and that you've identified those things prior to the race. It could be, like you said, some bigger purposes of, like, why you're running and the things like that. If that's not the case, I think trying to get in touch with what drives you as a runner, what is it? And I found this can be surprisingly hard to put into words. Most times, if I ask that question to an athlete directly, they don't have an answer. Sometimes they do, if they've thought about it, for whatever reason, but usually they don't. Usually it's like, I just am a runner. That's what I do, or whatever. And they're trying. It's not like they're not trying to answer my question. So digging a little deeper into, what are some parts of yourself maybe that you get to access running that you don't get to access in other parts of your life? What are the things that when you finish that you're like, what do you feel? What is that like, really, that sense of accomplishment, or that sense of, like, realizing you could push through something that you didn't think you could push through, and how that carries over to other parts of your life. So I think that's really valuable. A book that I really like that has nothing to do with athletics per se, but is very related, is Finding Your Why, or Start With Why. There's a Finding Your Why too, that's like a practical version, but Start With Why. Simon Sinek, big fan of his. You can find him on YouTube. You can, buy his book. He has a podcast, but the podcast is sort of an offshoot. But I'm a big fan of that, and he has a process laid out in the book. There's actually an online course too, where he leads you through a process to discover, like, what is your why, and put it into words. And I think I think the other related thing besides performance, of like when you're pushing through that negative self-talk, which I'll come back to that too, but I think it also helps with burnout, because if all your motivation is extrinsic, it can last for a while. It can be, it's not that can't be motivating, but I find that it's not as sustainable, and it's not, running is a long game sport, and so I think identifying that can really help with burnout, or avoiding burnout. And then back to the negative self-talk. Yes, I think that's a great antidote for when that voice in your head gets louder and louder and louder. And we can talk about this in more detail. I'm not a fan of thinking you can just suppress that. And not that doesn't work sometimes. It can work maybe in the short term, but having something else that you draw on that's like, right, this is why I'm doing this. The belt buckle lost that was long ago, many miles ago. They were like, yeah, whatever, I don't care about that. But, so what are you drawing on now that's really pushing you forward? Because it's usually the negative self-talk doesn't necessarily go away altogether. It comes and goes. That's what most people experience. Hopefully it fades. That's progress. But so, the really looking at, like, okay, what am I moving towards? What do I want to be thinking about? What is my motivation? And then what happens is that negative self-talk tends to fade. It's kind of like a snowplow. Like it's moving off to the side. You're not stopping to move it. You keep going, and you think about, this is the road I'm on. And then the thoughts they're still there, but they fade, and you can, focus. But without that, identifying, like, this is my motivation, and maybe having picked out a phrase or a mantra for, like, reminding yourself of that. It can be really hard when, you're in the midst of these long, arduous races. So definitely related.
Oh my God, so much right there. Let's talk about when you started to talk about burnout, especially during training, right? Like, you're 3 months into a training cycle, and your motivation's a little bit waning. You've got volume is increased, you're tired. That is a good time, I would say, to revisit your why and analyze, is this why still valid? Is it still deep enough to motivate me and to encourage me, or do I need to modify it or change it? Right. I think that's a great time to revisit it, and make sure, right? Like, check in and just say, is this still valid? And if not, again, change it, right? Try to figure it out. That's something you can ponder on, and just, come up with a new why, or again, modify the one you have, try to make it stronger, enhance it, really realize what you've been through. And I think a lot of times when that negative self-talk happens is when you are getting fatigued, when you're getting tired in that high training cycle. And, a good thing to remind yourself when that negative self-talk starts to come around, be it that you're like, oh, am I prepared enough? Like, look back at your diary, your training log, right? Like, look back at your resource, whatever that may be, whether it's Strava. My athletes use Training Peaks, like you and I had talked about. If it's a written log, keep a diary, keep a daily, content about how you're feeling, what you did. Like, look at the volume of everything that you've done. That should give you, courage. If you put in the work, if you put in 85% of the work, I always talk about this on the podcast, you're going to be fine. Like, if you have a training plan and you've done 85% of it, you're going to be fine. So take heart from that. Like, be encouraged by what you've done. Look at the total mass of the work, not just like a few days. Oh, I missed this key long run. okay, you missed that key long run, but look at all of the others. Look at how much you've done over the course of time. And without a training log of some sort, that's really hard to do. So, a training log can be so valuable in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
Anything you want to touch on there?
I like the 85%. I think I might use that just to borrow from your expertise. But I think that speaks to the preparation and yes, the looking back and having data to sort of counteract that voice that's like, oh, what if I'm not ready? I didn't do that one long run. No, look over here. Like, data that says I'm ready, because that preparation, such a good antidote for that negative self-talk of like, I don't know.
Right.
I think that's great.
And you started touching on mantras. When we create a mantra, can you touch on creating a strong mantra? What is, like, define what that would be?
Sure. So several components go into creating a strong mantra. One, it needs to be short, which most people kind of know, but I like 2, 3, 4 words. It could be a little longer, less than 8 though, because it needs to be easily retrievable. In mile 48 and you're really feeling it, and like you 2-sentence mantra is not going to do it. You need, a couple words, a short phrase. So it needs to be short. It needs to be positively worded. So meaning it doesn't include not. So not going to quit. That I would say just switch that around to persevere or something like that. So positively worded, short, action, either I like action verbs, but sometimes it can be adjectives, but something that when you read it, it really gives you some energy and some boost. And that might be obvious, but it's really important. It doesn't matter how it sounds to other people, or you may not, no one else may ever hear it. But when you read it, it's like, yes, that really means something to me. Like even shut in, I think that's a form of a mantra that means something to you. Done it many times, comfortable with that. Know I can do it. It just gives you a boost of like, right. So the wording means something to you and is like energizing. So those are some of the things to keep in mind, just as far as like how to like sort of the details of it. And then as far as the content, usually what I would do is look at one of two things. Either some of the negative self-talk that you're running into, is it that like this, I'm not prepared tape? And so then maybe you want your mantra to counteract that. I'm ready. I've done the work, or whatever it might be.
Right. I'm strong.
So it could sort of, I'm strong. So it could counteract some negative self-talk. It could hit on your why. It could hit on like the higher purpose or reason that you're doing this, that like you put that into a phrase that's like, right, this is why I'm doing this. I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing this for ... Or I'm doing this to show myself that ... Maybe not that long phrase. You just whittle that down into 3 or 4 words. So the content wise, those would be the 2 things I would keep in mind. And then as far as like what to do with it, leading up, I like having it visible, unless if you feel sort of okay with that, other people possibly seeing it. Sticky note on your water bottle, mirror of your bathroom, because you'll see that accidentally. Places where you'll see it in the course of your training or in the course of your day accidentally, so that you're not having to remind yourself. Because if you choose a good one, it's probably something you're not already thinking about, and so you want to run into it accidentally, again, to form those new pathways of like, oh, right, I am ready. Sometimes people also will write something on their body, like a green dot that represents it, or literally just the words. Somewhere where you're not going to sweat it off.
Right. I put it in permanent marker right next to my watch. So if I look down at my watch, it's right next to my watch.
Yeah.
Or that's I have great. A visual, like, family is a mantra to me. That's a powerful word. And I put a picture of my family in a plastic bag, and I pin it upside down to my race shorts, so that if I, when I look down, when my leg comes up, there's my family right there, and I get that reminder. It can be very powerful. Absolutely. Yeah. So, visual cues, I think, are tremendous. Anything else? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No. And the accident and the thing of like your leg comes up and you see it accidentally, I think is really important, because that's when you'll need it, is when you just are like struggling up a hill and you look down, you're like, oh, right. And that's what you want. You don't want to have to be searching for that, because it's, those are when you're at a low point, you want that boost just to be an easy reminder. So those are some of the things I would keep in mind as far as mantras go.
If we're talking about negative self-talk, is there ever a situation in which negative self-talk can actually have a positive benefit? I'm thinking of like, and this may be totally wrong, but if I'm in a hard workout, I'm getting towards the latter part of my intervals, right? And I say, come on, you wuss, let's go. I don't know if that's really technically defined as negative self-talk. I'm talking to myself negatively. So I don't know if it falls under that umbrella, but you get the point. What about in that, either in that scenario, or is there another scenario in which we can use negative self-talk in positive regard?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I have people ask me that, and especially runners, because I think, or distance athletes, because there can be some sort of being hard on yourself to get results, inner dialogue. So the short answer is I don't think that's always bad. I think it is very subjective for each person what's going to be motivating and what's going to be maybe unsustainable, like where you're just sort of beating yourself up. And maybe it works in that moment, but then over time you're like, that's not doing it. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind is like, is that working for me, and does it keep working? Great. Or is it like, man, when I'm not doing as well and I just keep calling myself a wuss over time, I'm like starting to like come down on myself too hard. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But so one way I think about this is there's a metaphor that I use that I really like called the passengers on the bus. And really, if I could only teach someone one tool, this is the tool that I would teach them. And so the idea is that you're the bus driver, you're driving the bus, and these different voices in your head, or these different parts of you, or these different patterns. Some people like that better, patterns, but we'll talk about them as passengers on the bus. And so they represent, those different self-talk that you hear. Could be positive, could be negative. And so sometimes there's like I'm not prepared. That might be one of the passengers on your bus. That's like when things get harder, when the race gets closer, you find that passenger on your bus gets up and starts talking louder, like, I don't know about this, Aaron. I don't think we're ready, and that's just sort of a thing that happens. And so one way that that I would look at that is that our goal isn't to get that passenger off the bus. One, that just doesn't really work. That's not how we're wired. To think that you can just be like, you're out of here, I'm not listening, that just doesn't really work. Two, there's often a positive that with those parts of ourselves, like you were alluding to, maybe they're pushing us. Maybe there's a time when we're actually not prepared and we shouldn't run. Like that's a reasonable conclusion. We're like, hey man, we're not ready for this. Like let's do a half marathon. And then, but there can be positives to those parts of ourselves that are like, hey, I don't know if we're ready. And then other times it's not. And so you you are ready, and it's just a fear. And so you as the driver, your job is like, okay, so I'm hearing that, and you're determining like, no, let's keep going. I think we're ready. And so the practice of it is, instead of sort of stopping the bus and like getting really wrapped up in it, which would be like really getting bogged down in that, like, I'm not ready. The idea is you acknowledge it, like, oh yeah, I hear that. That's a fear. That's something. That's a place my mind goes. But we're going to keep going this way. We're going to keep training. We're going to the race Saturday. And so what I found to be really powerful about it is it's very different than shut up, that part. Just stop talking. I don't need you, again, because that just doesn't really work. It also can have some negative effects, but it's just not as effective as, hey, I hear you. Yep. And we're good. That tends to just work better. It takes less energy. If you're in the middle of a run and that's happening, I find it to be way better to be like, oh, right. Yep. I hear that. and this is our race plan. This is what we're doing, and this is my mantra. And that will probably happen many times. That's not like, oh, it happened once at mile 40. No, it probably happened many times during the race that cycle happens. But I found that to be really helpful with dealing with negative self-talk. And to your question, there are times where that passenger on our bus who's like, come on, Aaron, is good. And it may be why you've gotten to where you are running. So it's not, you don't want to get rid of both. And then sometimes it's bad where you're like, no, I need to ease up. I need to take a day off, so you as the driver, you're making those decisions, and those parts of you are, doing their thing. So.
Great. There's two things there that I'd like to go a little deeper on, if you're okay.
Yeah.
So it used to be, like you said, you can only do it for so long that it retains some kind of motivation, like, telling yourself, come on, let's go.
Yeah.
So, I don't know how to put this without sounding like I'm schizophrenic, but I've kind of created a separate personality for the runner me.
Yeah.
So I say when I'm running, I refer to myself as Saft. Okay. So I'm like, come on, Saft, get going, get your butt in gear. Let's go. Come on, Saft, let's move. So it's like I'm talking to myself, right? But I'm talking to my running persona, right? Instead of like Aaron, Coach Aaron. That's that's the normal me. That's dad, right? That's me, Aaron. But when I'm out running, I become Saft. That's how I was always referred to, as my running friends always called me Saft. So I just started taking on this, instead of calling myself a wuss, I started calling myself Saft. Good job, Saft. You're working hard. I like it. Come on, keep pushing. So I kind of created a separate. Some people, they I think Addie Bracey referred it as to creating the superhero version of you, and having like a superhero version of you. I don't like look at myself as such, but it's having that kind of other personality to encourage, is kind of the way I kind of reframed it, if you will. If you want to, say anything on that.
No, and as far as like, sometimes when I introduce this passengers on the bus idea, I am a little bit nervous that people are gonna be like, wait, what? It's a personality, and no, like this is just how we're wired, where we have different parts of ourselves. And so that's a great example of that in a positive way, where Saft is up at the front of the bus. Like, you want him up at the front of the bus, right. Like, to kind of drowning out the rest, because, and definitely athletes, there's a book that I'll think of as soon as we stop, and maybe we can put it in the show notes. It's talking exactly about that superhero part of ourselves. And I think that's one of the amazing thing about sports, is that we get to access some other part of ourselves that in every day we don't, either because it's so challenging or because it's okay to be a certain way, in sports that's not in everyday life, or whatever it might be. But I think that's right in line with this, and giving those parts of us names actually really helps, because Saft is really easy to call up, like, and so that I encourage people to give names to those parts, because one, it's kind of funny sometimes, and two, it gives it more of like, oh, right, that's what's happening. It externalizes it a little bit if it's a negative, like, I'm not prepared. So I think that's great. And it just, the more you kind of get to know that part of yourself, the easier it is to call up and be like, right, that's who I am, right, for the course of this race. So I think that's right in line with this approach. And I'm not remembering the name he used, but Pele, who's arguably the best soccer player of all time, I read his biography, or his autobiography, recently, and he talked about, in order to sort of be the person he needed to be the most famous soccer player in the world, he was Pele. But then to be just a normal everyday guy, which was also important, to be with his family, to be, I'm totally forgetting the other name, but he switched.
Well, yeah,
and
you have to disengage, right?
Exactly.
You can't always be that forefront. Like, I picture him as like my psych up guy, right? Like, he's there kind of like my cheerleader, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, you can't always be there, right? Like, you can't always be engaged in that regard. It's like you have to step away sometimes and just calm down and be you.
Be you, and be in other relationships where the psych up guy might not be as well received, so it's important to be like, oh, okay, right, Saft, you can go take a seat for a little bit.
Go relax.
Yeah. So yeah.
And I think the other part of it that I wanted to touch on was I always tell my athletes, you need to change your vocabulary, right? Like if we're approaching a race and they're like, I am so nervous about this race. I say, let's change the vocabulary so it doesn't have such a negative connotation to it. Let's say, I am so excited for this race. I am so eager to race. Like, so instead of creating that dread or that negative emotion, right? That anxiety, you can almost feel them tense up when they say that, right? Like, I mean, I almost, you can see me starting to clench. Like, I know that feeling. But if we start to say, I'm excited for it and create that almost jubilation, right? Like, I always tell them, like, we have a journey and that's our training, and we have a celebration and that's our race. If we treat the race like a celebration, if we treat it like a positive experience, we're going to start reframing how we envision that race to be, right? We're going to look at it like in a positive light. So changing that vocabulary and how you think and how you speak about the race can also change your negative self-talk. I think that's a key component that I'd love for you to touch on.
Sure. Say that again about the training was what and the race was the celebration. I like that.
Yes, you've got your training is your journey, right? You've got this journey because that's the bulk of it. We're talking racing's typically, a day or maybe a few days, but that's your celebration, right? You've got this journey, all this work that you're doing, and then your celebration of all that work that you've done.
Yeah, I really like that. I've heard other terms used, but I like celebration more. So one thing just to add to that is on a nervous system level, excitement and nervousness are really almost identical. The difference is nervousness carries with it negative self-talk, like, oh, well, I hope this doesn't happen. Whereas excitement, you're like, this is going to be great, but your body actually feels the same, besides maybe a little bit of pit in the stomach if it's nervous versus like just. So I think that is changing your vocab and noticing. This is key for, working with a runner and helping them, like you said at the beginning, even identify that they're doing it is key, because you might realize it. Well, you said you're nervous now 5 times over the course of our conversation. It seems like you're focusing a lot on that. So let's talk about that vocabulary. So one, it would be noticing that they're doing it. And then 2, trying to reframe that nervousness as like, man, you've put in all this work and now you get to race. You get to like see the fruits of all of that hard work and see where it takes you and see how the race unfolds, which is, way different. And I think some people hear that as like, oh, well, but that's not how I feel. And the idea isn't that you're flipping a switch and you're, just super excited, but it's possible. It is, and it is important. It just takes practice of, with all of these things we're talking about, they're not like a one-time turn the corner and you're done. They're a noticing and like, oh, right, I'm back in the nervous place. Hey, let's think about it this way. And it's just catching it and trying, practicing it over and over and over, which is the good and the bad news, that you can change it, but that it really does take practice and intending to. But I like that. When that was pointed out to me, the nervous and excited, I was like skeptical at first, but then when you tune into that, you're like, oh, that actually is very similar. So yeah, I think that's a nice reframe.
That's a great point, how similar they really are. I want to be respectful of your time, but we have one big bucket that we haven't touched on, and I really want to touch on that, and that's injuries. And when we start creating negative self-talk around injuries, can you delve into that for us?
Sure. So that's something I've been learning a lot about recently because of my own. So I still play rec soccer, but as competitive-ish for being mid-40s and dealing with a lot of injuries lately, and I've become really interested in the relationship between fear of getting back out there and what that's doing physiologically. So you hurt your knee and then you're amping your training back up and your knee starts to hurt. And again, this is one of those passengers on the bus moment where it's like, okay, is that a back off? Is that okay, I'm gonna take a lighter day tomorrow? Or is that hey, your knee's gonna hurt you're getting all those muscles and tendons and, back to what they used to be. There's going to be some pain. And it's real. I found it's very, it takes a lot of effort to try to sort through that and to identify when there's a fear response, because what the fear response does is causes us to tighten up. And that's not going to help. That's not going to help healing. It's not going to help your actual running motion. You can probably picture someone or tell when you're doing it, when you're more tight and you're trying to run, you're like, oh, I got to favor this leg because this, and all you could just, I'm sure you could see it. It's like, oh no, that's not going to be good over the course of however many miles. So that fear response that either tightens us up or causes us to guard and then do something physiologically in a way that's not a good idea. And it's unconscious. That's the hardest part. It's like, it's not like we're like, oh, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to start doing this so that my knee doesn't hurt. And at first it's probably fine, but over the course of a training season or a long race, it's not going to be fine, And so identifying like, oh, that's probably is what's happening. Like, I wonder if your knee keeps hurting partly because you really had your physical therapist said you're good, you're back out there, but you're still wondering if you're good. And so that, I think, takes some effort as far as, the mental side, to talk yourself into like, hey, I've been given the all clear, let me try to reinterpret this pain as like, this is part of the process. And then of course, maybe it does happen where you're like, no, that's not part of the process. I need to stop running for a second but that fear response is tricky, really tricky to get to delineate, which is, and people say, oh, it's in your head. I don't like that phrase at all. It feels very kind of dismissive to me. Like, of course it's in your head, it's in your body. I mean, it's a natural response to want to protect. So even if you realize that, it's not like, oh, I can just let go. Yep. Oh, right. No, we're fine. It takes some work. So, but it is a very real part of injury recovery is, especially if it's chronic, if it's something that's happened several times, if it's been happening for a long time, that pattern has gotten more practice in your mind. And so it's going to take a little longer to unwind that. But it's tricky, and it overlaps, what you do, physical therapy, what I do, doctor. There's a lot of people involved trying to help someone recover. So it's, but I think it's an important component to help people. And we can talk in a minute about sort of approaches, but yeah, I think it is a big part of injury recovery, which, like I said, I've become really curious about, because of some of what I've been experiencing and just seeing how, and it's just so common in athletics, injuries happen. There's part of the deal. Yeah.
Awesome. And something you touched on there, struck a chord, because, a lot of times when we say, to our athletes who are nervous and are having negative self-talk, we say it's all in your head. And like you said, it's not. I mean, when you ask them, if you were to ask them, I don't think many people do, when they say, I am so nervous, like, where do you feel that nervousness? And they're not going to say in their head. That's like the last place they say, that they're going to feel it. They're going to feel it in their gut. Right. So there's a lot more going on to this than, just recognizing like, that they're nervous. They're creating things throughout their body, that are having this effect and creating a negative impact. Perhaps we're dumping too much adrenaline into the system, and we're just creating too much anxiety, upping our cortisol right before a race. It's like the last thing we want is to have too much cortisol leading right into a race. So, we have to learn, and, perhaps this is a great, conversation for another podcast, but we have to learn, how do we calm those athletes down? How do we get them in that mindset that they're about to race, right? Like, to get them to calm their nerves, because it may not be like that they're having a tremendous amount of negative self-talk. It may be that they're just generating too much anxiety within themselves, facing this task of the race, right? But I was on the Strong Mind podcast, and they talked about that. The Strong Mind podcast. A lot of times it's about climbing and dealing with. She's very in touch with being mindful. I think she's maybe I guess a mentor for meditating, whatever, however you want to term it. But
could be a mindfulness coach. That's
mindfulness coach. Yep. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. But anyhow, it's a great podcast because they don't always talk about climbing, and sometimes they branch off and talk about mindsets and dealing with, these scenarios, especially even if it is dealing with climbing. You can imagine that like the situations they're facing could be dire, right? Like, and how do you deal with that kind of stuff? And you can take away so many different mindsets from, what they're describing. So,
yeah.
But anyway, that's where I pulled that from. So I want to thank you for saying that, because it is true. Like when we are nervous, we don't usually feel it in our minds. So it's not all in our minds. There's other things going on, and we have to learn how to deal with those things.
Yeah.
Going back to what you were finishing on, you wanted to touch on one more piece of that injury bucket. Trying to remember do you remember what you were?
Tools to help.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I would say a couple different things. Some of what we've already talked about can be really helpful if the fear of re-injury or the fear of what's going on, what the pain is telling you, creates negative self-talk. Then a lot of the tools we've already talked about can be really helpful. Okay, if my knee starts hurting, this is the mindset I'm going to have. My doctor said I'm ready. I'm going to, I can, it's strong. I can push through that. So it could be dealing with the negative self-talk that's sort of secondary to whatever your pain you're feeling or fear of re-injury or things like that. Visualization, there's research on visualization helping with injury recovery in two ways. One, more of the way we talked about, where you're picturing yourself being successful, picturing yourself out there running and your knees feeling great. But the other way is literally picturing, with the site of the injury healing. And for some people, that's a little more out there. But again, a lot of research showing that like you're picturing those muscles reforming, reattaching, strengthening. And what you're doing with that is you're sending a message to your brain of like, hey, that's what's happening. My knee is strong. My hamstring is strong. My hamstring is healed, and just in the same way we talked about visualization for other things, that's making this connection. I'm like, yes, that's what's happening. It's strong. I'm ready, and does it mean you're not going to have any pain or not have any fear? Probably not. But it's another tool that you're sending a message to yourself that, yes, that's the opposite of like, ooh, I wonder what's going to happen. So visualization can be helpful in both those ways of picturing what you want to happen, how you want to feel, and then literally picturing, visualizing the healing process.
Awesome. Thank you for all of that. Is there anything else that you would like to touch on? Anything we missed that would be remiss not to go through?
I think we hit everything on my list. Yeah. So
man, Andrew, that was I loved that conversation. I want to thank you for your time and for sharing all this with us. How can folks connect with you?
Sure. So several ways. My website is findyourheadwaters.com. So my business is Headwaters Coaching. So findyourheadwaters.com, and my email, Andrew@headwaterscoach. Andrew@headwaterscoach. So both those ways. And yeah, I really appreciate you having me on, Aaron. I really enjoy talking about this stuff, and that flew
my
by.
pleasure.
Shocked that was an hour and 15 minutes.
Absolutely my pleasure, Andrew. It was such a great conversation. Thank you so much again for coming on. I will have Andrew's information in the show notes if you'd like to reach out to Andrew if you have any questions or want to have a session with Andrew and go through some of your negative self-talk or any other things that you may be going through. Andrew is a wonderful resource, and I'll be honored if he would come back on so we can talk about further pieces of the mental game. So thank you so much, Andrew.
Yeah. Take care.
Well, thank you again to Andrew Bednarzik. That was, like I said, at the intro, such a awesome conversation. I really, I can't say how much that I enjoyed that and I took away from it. So thank you, Andrew, for your time and for sharing that with us. I'm going to be sure to have Andrew on in the future. As we wrapped up our conversation after we recorded, we talked about the potential for future episodes. I have Miriam Saloom on here as my physical therapist. She does some wonderful episodes, and I think Andrew can be a repeat guest and shed light on a lot of things that we all can take away and improve on. So stay tuned for some more episodes with Andrew. Definitely want to be respectful and mindful of his time as well, but we both really enjoyed the conversation and think folks can take a lot away from it. Again, if you're looking to to perhaps improve your mental game, or you have some questions for Andrew, I will have his information and contact in the show notes, so you can go in there and reach out to Andrew, or just say thank you for the episode. That's always nice if we kind of thank guests, especially if we take a lot away from it. So don't hesitate to reach out and just drop a note of thanks for coming on the podcast and being a part of it. So thank you again, Andrew. Before I get into the Q&A from the listeners, just a few things to touch base on. Some folks had asked me, they saw my Strava from my Saturday long run, and I kind of did a test run just to kind of see where my heart rate was. As a side note, I've been using the Wahoo product, the strap from Wahoo, the Ticker X product. And, unfortunately I've been having some problems. The unit just seems to die after a period of time, no matter, if you replace the battery or not. I just kept having this issue. And this one lasted me, unfortunately about maybe a month, just over a month. It was a replacement product for one that had broken as well. So I just kind of got a little flustered. So I switched over to the Polar H10. Hadn't tried the Polar product yet, so the only thing I had tried was their bicep strap, but that works more off of optical. So wasn't really pleased with that. So I was hesitant to try any other Polar product, but I went with their Polar H10 chest heart rate strap and used it for that run, and I was very pleased with the product. Just as anything in this podcast, I don't have any affiliation with them, so it's I'm not trying to make any gains by saying that, but so far so good. Pleased with how it did. But it also gave me a good sense of next weekend, what to expect. Having pivoted from my Tennessee race, for those that don't know, the race that I had planned on doing, and I did the podcast episode after doing my my scouting run out in Tennessee at Franklin State Park. I was informed on Wednesday that the race was canceled. They had closed the park and were not allowing anyone into the park, so the race itself got canceled on Wednesday. So I had to quickly pivot and find a different race. I found the Bootlegger outside of Atlanta in near Jackson, Georgia. It's a 5-lap race for me, so it's a 10-mile lap, obviously, and it's a figure 8, and in the middle of the figure 8 is the start, finish, and aid station. So I can see my family a bunch of times. I was just informed yesterday that my friend Nathan, who paced me out at Bigfoot, and who's part of many of my adventures, he's going to be there and racing as well. So that will be awesome to have a friend there. So I'm excited for that opportunity, grateful for the fact that I was able to get in. The race was sold out, and I just emailed them to see if I could hop on the wait list in case anybody dropped. Sure enough, somebody did drop, and I was the first person to reach out, and so I got in. And Nathan was in the same boat. So just really, grateful that I'm still able to have this opportunity. I do need a 50-mile finish in order to run the Vermont 100. That is one of their requirements. So, this is part of that. Also have to do some trail work, or volunteering. So I'm looking to do that here in the near future. But anyhow, really looking forward to next weekend. But with the change in course, it changed my race strategy and race plan. This course looks very runnable. There's about 60-ish feet per lap of gain, so 660 feet over 10 miles. So not very much gain. So I basically ran on my road yesterday. My road is dirt and pretty flat, so I just kind of wanted to see where my heart rate was. Now, Ron Wyant, he asked on the internet, he finds training paces, but they're suited towards the roads. And he said, is there any way to do a conversion for trail running? Now, Ron, it's going to depend obviously on, and I hate starting answers like that because my next one has it depends statement as well, but it really depends on what type of trails are you running on. When we talk about the roads, they're talking about pretty much a flat, kind of road or greenway. If you're running on a flat dirt road like I was, you're talking between 5 to 10 seconds probably per mile. Now, if you're talking on something hilly, obviously the hills come into play. If you're talking about a single track, more technical, windy single track, it's going to start going up, 15 to 20 seconds, potentially even more, just depending on the severity of the trail, the elevation gain, all of that stuff comes into factor. Now, what I would suggest, Ron, is that taking note, if you were to do a road run and noting your heart rate, and then do a trail run, perhaps your regular route, you could look at, Strava, for instance, if you have Strava, and see what is your gap pace, your graded average pace. They will tell you when you go on the trail what it would have been had you been on the roads and see if it's comparable. So that's one way to do it. Now, there is no true conversion. They have their own algorithm. I have no algorithm or know of no algorithm. I don't know what their algorithm is to convert, trail to road pace. But kind of going through things in my mind, that's probably your best way to know. And that way, for future purposes, you could know approximately, okay, so, this was the translation. How much was that translation? How many seconds per mile? And then you could, obviously convert that for further pacing. Okay. So I think that's your best bet, Ron, is to use that gap pace in Strava if you have that and have that feature. Okay. So my biggest suggestion there. So back to what I was saying for my race, just kind of wanted to see where my heart rate fell at different paces. Now it's supposed to be pretty warm next weekend. We have a 5 a.m. start, so we'll start with some cooler temperatures. But as the day warms up, heart rate's going to climb, not only due to the exertion but to the temperatures. We're looking at potentially 79, 80 degrees for the high next Saturday. As of right now, I am recording this on Sunday, and so 6 days away. That could change. Obviously, they are forecasting some thunderstorms, 50% chance. So looking ahead, that could be a factor. But as of right now, when I looked at heart rate data, I was thinking in my head, perhaps 9-minute pace was kind of where I was thinking my fitness was, and I was pretty close. It's going to fall somewhere between 8:45 and 9-minute pace to be in that kind of high zone 2, low zone 3 kind of sustainable pace for 50 miles. Now, this, again, my goal is to get my qualifier. I'd love to run a PR. If I could run sub 9-minute pace, I will be on PR pace, which would be awesome, but we're going to see what the day presents. I don't want to come away, A, with an injury, or B, with needing much time for recovery, just because of where this falls in my training cycle. So, looking at that data, I kind of got a good idea. I tried to run something that would be pretty comparable to what I'll see next weekend. I asked about the trail, the surface, because I don't know much about the trails where we're racing. So the race director said that they're pretty buttery smooth. The race director wears road shoes to go for runs. So just trying to get a little bit more information about the trails and what to expect. So that's why I did it yesterday. Used my gear, I packed my pack, took about a bottle of fluids every hour, and consumed 180 calories every 35 minutes, which is my plan for next weekend. So tried to replicate everything the best I could. I actually started in the rain yesterday morning on my long run, and temperatures weren't too hot. I was in the 60s, I believe, when I started. So, kind of it just creeped up a little bit. I may have gotten to the mid 60s by run's end. So I can't quite replicate what the temperatures will be and what my heart rate will do at those temperatures, because obviously I'm not heat acclimated at this time, but we'll see how that presents itself. So with the pivot, I had to change race strategy, looking at just carrying one bottle with me for each 5-mile segment. So my crew will have another bottle and another gel ready for me each time I come around. I plan on using my old Revolt pack by Ultra Aspire. Those of you that are not familiar with the Revolt, it is now the Basham, the race vest. So that's what I'm going to, so I don't have to carry anything. I'll just have that pack. So that's my plan. Use that. So far as footwear goes, I'm going to bring a bunch of stuff with me. Now, again, the RD said that road shoes would be fine. So I'm going to bring the Phantom 2s as a potential. Really like those. Hope to get a glimpse of what the trails will present. But if I'm not comfortable with the Phantom 2s, I'll probably just go with the Ultra Mont Blanc. Just got a new pair of those from FootRx. Been messing around with the lacing. I did a YouTube video on how I use the lacing system because a lot of times people have problems. So I use an awl and create some new eyelets so I can get more security out of the shoe. I'm also switching the laces over to a flat lace. So the shoes come with an oval lace, and I'm thinking with that, if I put a flat lace in, I'll get more surface area, which should secure the shoe down even more. I know, really, really nerdy thinking here, but just thinking how I can get more security out of the shoe, and I think a flat lace is going to give me that more security. I've been working on that this morning. I created the new eye holes, tried to put a new pair of laces in. They were a little short, so I need a longer pair of laces, but I'm going to keep messing with that over the course of the week. But yeah, so there's my level of thinking, the gear I plan on using, strategy I plan on implementing. Hopefully that gives you a little bit more insight into how I think and plan on these races. So that's going into next weekend, next Saturday. Nathan and I will be racing the Bootlegger 50 miler. So, moving past that, everything is going great. I appreciate, again, those that are reaching out for coaching. Just so awesome to have folks asking about coaching. Had 2 new folks reach out to me this week. I had some of my old athletes that I coach approach me for getting back into coaching, which is awesome. And I had one of my previous athletes that's becoming a coach, which I'm so excited for her. Charity Pairing. She's looking to get into doing some coaching for women, which is tremendous. I love the fact that, it's a female coach, and that she wants to do it specifically for females. I think that's wonderful. So she asked if I would help mentor. So that's the second coach I've been asked to help mentor, and I absolutely, I feel privileged to do so, and help them, kind of guide them on their journey. I think it's wonderful to have, some more female presence as coaches in our sport. So I'm happy to help guide and mentor these young coaches. So that's pretty awesome. Love the fact that I'm moving up into that capacity. On Friday, I have to brag on my kids for a moment. I have the joy of coaching high schoolers. On Friday, we had a really cool relay event. And if you've watched the Olympics or the World Championships by chance for track and field, there is a new event called the Mixed Gender 4x400 meter relay, in which there are 2 females and 2 males, and you can choose what order in which they run. We had 4 of our kids, and one of which was my son, Keegan, on the team, obviously, and they blew it out of the water. They set a national record for the high school 4x400 meter mixed gender relay. Realizing, of course, this doesn't happen a lot. This race doesn't happen a lot, but they put themselves into the history books, which is pretty awesome. This event will be included in the North Carolina State Championships as of 2024. It won't be this year, but it's so cool that race is coming into the fold for these kids. And it was really cool because Manteo Mitchell was at the race. Manteo was a silver medalist at the London Olympics in the 4x4. You may remember in the qualifiers, I believe in the World Championships just prior to the London Olympics, he broke his leg and still managed to finish and get the U.S. into the finals. What a story. So he was there and present. The race was named for him, and he had some USA team singlets, bodysuits, just pieces for these kids, and he gave them these awesome uniforms. So if you saw on social media the kids in the USA kits, you can't imagine the smiles that were on their faces. Oh my gosh, it melted my heart just to see the happiness that it brought these kids. And that's the moment you live for as a coach, just seeing these kids not only have the success, but having fun with our sport, and seeing all their teammates share in that success, how happy they were, not only for their teammates, but to be a part of that. That's really what the team vibe is, what we're looking for. And they're creating it themselves. They're creating that culture, which is just outstanding. I love it. I love the opportunities these kids have, and that fact that they have, such great people in the community like Mateo to celebrate with. It's just amazing that he came out to this meet and brought these uniforms out. He did autographs afterwards. It was just such an awesome evening. Like I said, what a great experience. So very cool. Congratulations to the West Henderson High School 4x4 mixed gender relay team for their national record. They ran 3:44, which was incredible. So awesome stuff. On to the other question that I had. This came from Strava, and I believe it was Jay asked. He's trying to figure out what average distance he should do for his daily runs. Let's kind of go over the spectrum of the week. Now, depending on how many days you run, you're probably going to have your long run. That's one run. I would suggest a medium long run. Usually, if you're just building, the medium long run is 2/3 the volume or distance of your long run. And then, so for instance, if I did a 13-mile long run, I'd be looking at 9 to 10 miles for your medium long run. And then your average run is about 2 to 3 miles less than your medium long run. So 7 to 8 miles for your average run. In time, I may be looking at 50 minutes to an hour for your regular run, an hour 20 to an hour 30 for your medium long run, an hour 45 to 2 hours for your long run. Okay, so that's kind of the distinction and how it breaks down. Like I said, about medium long run is about 2/3 of your regular long run, and then diminish again. So potentially like a third of your long run, or third to half of your long run is what your average run should be. And of course, grow that. Now, how can you tell if that's too far? You can look at heart rate drift. So if you're taking heart rate data, you're going to get some heart rate drift, especially as it gets hotter, no matter what. But, if that heart rate's getting too high at, an average pace, you're probably going too long. Your body needs a little bit more aerobic capacity and a little bit more potential for growth in your average run. Okay, so you'd have to start a little bit smaller and then grow. Okay, we typically don't want to add too much to our runs. Okay, so if your average run is let's just say it's 30 minutes. Okay, if it's 30 minutes, then your medium long run's 45 minutes. Your long run may be an hour. Okay, and as you get comfortable with that, as that heart rate seems to stay steady at your zone 3 pace, your conversational pace, then you can grow it. Now, I wouldn't go huge jumps, and I've talked about this in the past, where adding 10 to 15 minutes to each run is fine, up to 20 minutes even, if you have that capacity. Again, kind of looking at your data to see, was that too much? Make sure you get comfortable at that distance. You don't have to go up every week. You may spend 2 to 3 weeks at a long run, and that means keeping your other runs at the same. You're going to build more aerobic capacity that way, which is the key to your training, is building that aerobic capacity. So be patient with it. Allow that stuff to grow. Okay, so if 30 minutes is where you're at, that's fine. You can grow from there. Okay, so be okay with that, starting wherever you're at and growing from there. Again, so and then the next growth cycle may be 40 to 45 minutes for your regular run, and then an hour 10 to an hour 15 for your medium long run, and an hour 40 to hour 45 for your long run. You can kind of see the growth there. Okay. Just, again, get comfortable with it. If you're not comfortable with it, that's okay. Stick to the time that you're used to, or that you're able to do, so that you keep growing a little bit. Then you can add on. It's not to say that if your heart rate's not there at that first jump, you can still try it the next week. Okay. So if you went from an hour 30 to an hour 45 and the hour 45 is a little tough, you can still try an hour 45 the next week and see if it makes it any easier. You can look at your data from week to week. If your training route is pretty similar or the same. Okay, it's always good to compare like to like. You can't compare an hour 45 on a flat greenway to an hour 45 on the trails. That's not a fair comparison. So make sure you're comparing oranges to oranges. Okay. So Jay, I hope that helps answer your question about your average run and how to know if it's too long or long enough and how to grow your average run. So if it didn't, let me know. I'll see if I can answer it a different way or give you a better breakdown. But, so I use time. That's why I put time there. But again, if you're at 3 miles, your medium long run may be 5 miles, your long run may be 7 to 8 miles. If your average run is 5 miles and you're comfortable at 5 miles, your medium long run could be 8 and your long run could be 10 and 11 miles, maybe even 12. Okay. So that's kind of how it breaks down. The 3 different, we're looking, about, typically about maybe 2 to 3 miles between each. So from your average run to your medium long run, 2 to 3 miles difference. From medium long run to long run, 2 to 3 miles of increased distance. Okay, so I hope that really makes sense. Hope that helps. Again, thank you guys for the questions. Thank you all so much for the support, for your comments. I want to thank Amy Scott for her donation to both of the charities of which I'm raising funds for the Grand Slam. Again, if you can help out in my fundraising opportunities for the Vermont Adaptive and the Challenge Athlete Foundation, those links are in the show notes. Like I said in the last episode, it not only means the world to me, but it makes a difference in the lives of so many different challenged athletes. And that's the purpose of this, is to help others. So if you can support that cause, please go to those links. Add a donation. I would love to see, by the time I race, we've topped 10,000 in fundraising for the 2 charities. That would be incredible. Just my heart would be, it's already full, but I would be so overwhelmed, so joyous. The races are the celebrations, and I'm already going to celebrate because we've done a tremendous job together of raising these funds. But I thank you if you can consider donating. You're an amazing person. You're an amazing person either way. But I really thank you guys for the consideration and the contributions. So with that, I want to say thanks again to Andrew for this conversation. I'm not sure what the following week may bring. I've got a few ideas in my head. I'm going to start reaching out to a few individuals on some ideas that I have for guests. But if you have a suggestion or want to be a guest, don't hesitate to reach out. Again, all of my contacts are going to be in the show notes. Andrew's contacts are going to be in the show notes. And once again, thank you all for the support. Until next time, keep running, my friends.